Bruce? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Erica Jung. I'm the director for the Center for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning, and as well the co-chair for the OER working group here at the U of M. I come from a family of immigrants who came to Turtle Island and made our home on Treaty 13 land. Today, this event is being held on original lands of Anishinaabe, Innu, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So welcome to this Open Education Week event. It's great to see the growing interest of the U of M community around OERs. I was just speaking with someone prior to us starting about how it's starting to grow, and so that's always an exciting thing. And it's really, you can see it represented by even just the attendance here today. Open educational resources have at its foundation the goal of making knowledge available for everyone, and without a cost associated to it. So some of you may have been early adopters or advocates for OERs, and it's probably really refreshing actually to be in a room full of like-minded individuals who are interested and invested in OERs and Indigenous knowledges within OER. I look forward to hearing our time today, the panel discussion, and the people who will be sharing about adoption, creation at the U of M. But as well, I really look forward to hearing about how we can learn to honor Indigenous knowledges and protocols in our teaching, our practices, our research through open education. So I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker today. Kayla Lar-Son is a member of the Metis Nation of Alberta with a mix of Ukrainian heritage and is originally from Tofield, Alberta. She holds a BA in Native Studies and a Master's of Library Science from the University of Alberta. Her work has included the Indigenous programs and services and the Indigitization program at the Waiwa Library at the University of British Columbia, where she is currently the acting head. So please join me in welcoming Kayla this afternoon.
Hi, everybody. Good morning from Vancouver. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So thank you for having me here to give this presentation, and I will get started and share my screen for everybody. Okay. Sorry, just doing the Zoom fumble to get everything together. Okay, perfect. So I titled my talk today for my keynote, Reflections on Amiskwaciy. So the area that I grew up in is known as Amiskwaciy, the Beaver Hills in Treaty 6. And a lot of my life, my work is reflective of growing up in the prairies, growing up right outside of Amiskwaciy, Waskahigan, or Edmonton, and also the transformation of my life into moving to the coast and how I still keep Treaty 6 very close to me, as I always will. So again, just a little bit more about me. I am joining you today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam community. And I am joining you from the Kukuli or Huiqua Library here at UBC. That's currently where I am. I'm in my office this morning. However, I do come from Treaty 6 territory. I thought I'd share this little photo of one of the still standing grain elevators that is just down the highway from where I grew up. And this is from the community of Shants. The joke is that somebody painted dirty shorts on it many years ago. So it's one of the things that just reminds me of home when I'm thinking about the prairies. I think about the landscape like this, the farm equipment, and growing up in Treaty 6 territory. So I do have a Bachelor of Native Studies from the University of Alberta, where I studied rights-based litigation research using archives under Dr. Frank Tuff, and then later went on to my master's degree at the University of Alberta, where I studied library and information sciences, went on to teach for a couple years within the library program there, and then also worked in digital initiatives, Cameron Library, so the science library, as well as in the social sciences and humanities library, Rutherford. And I was an outreach librarian for the transition year program there, as well as for Walls to Bridges program, which brings incarcerated women into the university. After working at the University of Alberta, I saw the opportunity to work at Huiquad Library, and Huiquad Library is one of the only Indigenous focused academic libraries on all of Turtle Island. And so that makes it really unique. And when that opportunity came up to be the programs and services librarian here, I decided to make the move from my home territories to work in a space that embraces Indigenous librarianship and incorporates Indigenous worldviews into all aspects of the practice. I had been working as the programs and services librarian for about 3.5 years, when in January I took on the role of acting head of the library, while also holding still my position as the programs and services librarian. So doing a lot of the administrative work, but also doing community programming, outreach in areas like the downtown east side, outreach with Orange Shirt Day, Kids Take Over UBC, things like that. I previously was working with the Indigitization program as well, which helps communities to digitize their cultural heritage in a way that makes sense to them and allows for the continuation of sovereignty of communities to only to be able to interact with cultural heritage in a way that makes sense and aligns with their own protocols and practices, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So just to kind of start off with the foundation of OER, so as was before, some folks in the room right now might be early adopters of OER or really, really knowledgeable in the OE movement. However, there's some folks that might not be so knowledgeable about it. So I thought I'd give a little bit of an introduction on OERs before we move into Indigenous open educational resources and kind of the transformation and rethinking that we need to do when working with Indigenous OE. So just to start off, an OER is pretty much a teaching and learning resource or tool that is created with the intention of being freely available to users. This might include, but not limited to, things like textbooks, readings, multimedia files, courses, YouTube videos, podcasts, things like that. But it's a teaching and learning resource that is freely available to users. So the term OER was defined by UNESCO in 2020. And one of the things that they're noted about is being covered by licenses that allow for things like the using, remixing, and sharing of many people. One of the things that OERs tried to do is break down barriers for authors and educators when it comes to publishing, as well as for users as they break down barriers with paywalls, and those are often alleviated with the use of open education resources. So there are some key moments within kind of the open access movement that date way, way back to probably when I was in elementary school. So we have when software is first coming out in the 1980s, there is this movement of it being freely available and software being able to be remixed. So really open education and the whole movement around OE starts in software development. So as more folks are starting to monetize the code on software, this is when we see this shift in around the 1997, 98 with FOSS, FLOSS, Merlot, and free and open source software coming into play and folks starting to adopt this. One of the first coursewares that is open access is the MIT courseware in 1990. And then later we see kind of this shift into the more advocacy and activism side in the 2000s around open courseware for the Berlin Declaration on Open Access, and more kind of the advocacy around open access movements that's not necessarily focused so much on software development. Later on, we have in the kind of mid 2000s, so 2012, there's the Paris OER Declaration. And then from 2013 to onwards, we're seeing more and more recommendations coming out for open educational resources, support for funding from things like granting institutions, federal government, things like that. And now we're seeing a shift into thinking differently about open education and how they can fit into marginalized or Indigenous communities, BIPOC communities, queer communities, and how we can start to support the very specific needs of those communities with open educational resources. And also thinking about, what is OE and what are the impacts that also OE can have maybe in a negative way on these communities. One of the most notable things to come out of the open education movement is the 5 R's of OERs. And so David Wiley is the individual who created the 5 R's. Originally, it started with 4 R's in 2006, 2007, with the addition of the 5th R in 2014. So the 5 R's of OERs are to retain, so the right to make, own, and control copies of content, reuse, so the right to use the content in a wide variety of ways, revise, so the adaptation or modification of the content, remixing, so the right to combine the original and revised content with other open content to create something new, and redistribute, so the right to share copies of the original content, your revisions, or the remixes with others. However, Indigenous OERs are kind of coming forward as their own thing. And this is one thing that, we recently had a Indigenous OER summit here at UBC, and there's lots of questions around Indigenous OERs. There's lots of questions around the frameworks that need to be developed for Indigenous OE. And exactly what is it? And I think this is one of the things that we're struggling with as Indigenous OEs. They're not necessarily new, as places like eCampus Ontario, BC Campus have been creating Indigenous OERs. But I think the shifting in the framework and the need to develop protocols around them is something that we're really struggling with at this point, and even defining what an Indigenous OER is. So as I said, what exactly is an Indigenous OER? So there's many different variations of Indigenous OE. So we can see Indigenous OERs as Indigenous community created OERs. So these could be things that communities are creating for themselves on Pressbooks. This could be things like language revitalization materials, community cultural practice revitalization materials, or materials for on-reserve learners, urban Indigenous learners, but have that Indigenous focus. So the community is the focus within it. And then we have OERs that have Indigenous content in them. So these can be OERs that are maybe for post-secondary use, that talk about the history of Indigenous folks, the current realities of Indigenous folks, but don't really have that target audience of Indigenous community members. So these can be things that are like settler OERs, settler education OERs. So really, when we're trying to define Indigenous OE, this is our struggle, as it is many different things. So when trying to break this down, I always try and assess what exactly the OER is, so we can look at rights, protocol, access based off of the OER. So the assessment for it is, who is the audience? So like I said, is a community the audience? Are post-secondary educators the audience? Are the global public the audience? Like, who is our audience? What exactly is the content that's being shared? Is this community stories? Is this community lived realities, traditional knowledges, things like that being shared within an OER? Or is this secondary content, things that have already been published, things that are coming from a non-Indigenous perspective, things that are out of other OERs, other textbooks, things like that? And then also, is there any protocol that needs to be associated with the OER? And we'll get into protocol a little bit later when talking about frameworks and developing and rethinking our understandings of Indigenous OERs. One of the things to note too is that within open education and Indigenous knowledges in higher education, there are different supports at different levels. So within Canada, province and territories vary greatly in their support for open educational resources. Like I said, here in BC, we have BC Campus, there's eCampus Ontario, but in areas like Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, the Atlantic provinces, the support for OERs, funding for OERs coming from provincial levels, from federal levels, is very different. There's also a significant variance in the support for the place of Indigenous knowledges within the landscape of higher education. Some universities embrace having Indigenous voices within academia, within publishing a lot more than others, and those on-campus supports vary differently as well. As well as there's also variance at the level of individual higher educational institutions across, so for working together. One of the most notable right now kind of papers that's out there that kind of set out the framework for what exactly Indigenous OERs are and how we handle them is Krista McCracken and Skyly Hogan's paper on Indigenous OERs. And this paper very much so is a framework for how to work with Indigenous knowledges within open educational resources, but comes from a highly localized perspective, so in Northern Ontario. And again, this is one of those things that when we're working with Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous open educational resources, it's hard to do so on a national level and to try and develop a national framework for them because knowledges are so highly localized and knowledges are rooted in the land. So that's why McCracken and Hogan are very specific even when talking about OERs in their paper and saying that it is localized. So right now, this is the closest thing that we have to actually a framework that is available out there that we can work on for Indigenous OERs. So McCracken and Hogan in their paper outline that when creating Indigenous OERs, relationships have to come first. Relationships need to be developed long before projects come into fruition, and relationships also need to be ongoing as well. They bring in the concept of nothing about us without us. And this includes the development of OERs, bringing in community members, community voices into OERs. And collaboration should also extend from the project from the start of it into the completion of it as well. As we know, OERs should be updated. They should not be necessarily orphaned. And when things need to be updated, we need to do community consultation within OERs. As well as they talk about the integration of principles such as OCAP into the OER development. We'll talk about OCAP in a while, but OCAP stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession of Indigenous Knowledges. So we can start to add different principles that support Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous self-determination, and Indigenous ownership and rights of knowledge into OER creation. As well as they really highlight that not all Indigenous knowledges want to be open. Researchers and academics are not the ones who should decide which knowledges should be open. This comes from community members, knowledge holders, and elders. These are the folks that need to make these decisions. We shouldn't be sharing information without consent and guidance from the communities that these knowledges come from. And also we need to clearly inform partners with where the information will appear, how it's supposed to be disseminated, and what is the intent of it as well. So getting informed consent of community members and buy-in when coming onto these projects, as well as how information is shared matters. So Creative Commons licensing and the 5 Rs of OERs don't always meet the needs of Indigenous communities, and how information is shared and not shared can also really affect the intent of the OER and how the community understands its use, things like that. So as we can see, there's not really a foundational framework other than what has been put out there by McCracken and Hogan. There are Indigenous OEs from eCampus Ontario, as well as BC Campus, such as the paddling series from BC Campus. So there's things like this. And one of the things that OE advocates are trying to do is create a national framework. However, we're getting a bit stumped in meetings. We can't come necessarily to a consensus of next way forward. And a lot of this is because we need to go back and look at kind of how we can use some tools that already exist, reshape our understanding of Indigenous OE, even maybe rename it, asking ourselves really tough questions like, what is Indigenous open education? Can we even call it open? What is the understanding of open within this context? and really to engage with elders and community members more, which, as we know, across Turtle Island can be difficult as communities are so diverse. Elders have different teachings. We want to incorporate those teachings. So on the national level where we're sitting with this, it is difficult. However, at a localized level, we can really look at, things that have worked, things that haven't worked, and bring in that localized context into open educational resources. So I wanted to start off by kind of thinking about some of the places where we've gone wrong, where we can learn from and change our thinking about research as OERs. They need research, they need curriculum development, and then moving into frameworks, moving into Indigenous methodologies, Indigenous understandings, worldviews that can be used within Indigenous-based OERs that can really kind of set forward and have that good intent brought into them. So when we're thinking about the impact of Western knowledge on Indigenous thought, educational institutions have been guided by Western bias. This Western bias has transformed the plurality of knowledge systems into a hierarchy of knowledge systems. Indigenous knowledge systems and knowledge transmission were deemed to be inferior when compared to Western traditions, as well as Western research is constituted by a set of ideas, practices, privileges that are embedded within imperial expansion and colonization. These ideas, practices, and privileges later become institutionalized by academic disciplines, schools, curriculums, and universities. Under colonial influence of intellectual heritage, non-Western thought has been devalued and misinterpreted. In addition, the researcher is put into an arbitrary position of power and given authority over a discipline and a subject that they specialize in. So when looking at this, even within the creation of OERs, the individual who is creating the OER is looking at what content should be added, what languages the OER should be in. That person then is in this position of power, and in sometimes this arbitrary position of power. As OERs are open, anyone can create them. It's like writing a paper. Anyone can write a paper, whether or not a community gives you permission or not to do so. In addition, the majority of Indigenous focused research projects to this day are being conducted by non-Indigenous folks. Researchers tend to select subjects or projects based on personal interest. This leads to communities being inundated with research requests that do not actually benefit to the community in any direct way, or leads in some cases to irrelevant research and data outputs. There's a lack of informed consent in research. Research is not being returned to communities or disseminated in the language of that community. And also there is the continued utmost disrespect and disregard by non-Indigenous researchers for things like Indigenous traditional knowledges, stories, ceremonies, and things like ancestral remains as well. However, there is a shift. I would say there's a huge shift, and there has been a huge shift in research and the way that research has been conducted, specifically with the kind of growth of Indigenous academics entering into academia and taking up space within academia and changing the way that research happens. So Indigenous-led research emerges from the incorporation of Indigenous lived experiences, languages, and worldviews into the research process. It centers Indigenous peoples and communities as the researcher and the primary authority on a subject or a topic. Indigenous research is accountable, reciprocal, and it also integrates things like mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual aspects of knowledge gathering and sharing. As well, Indigenous research methodologies follow the same trajectory as Indigenous research methods, as they dismiss colonial understandings of the research process and incorporate the use of techniques and methods drawn from traditions and the knowledges of the people. So when I think of, and I read this, I think of how can we start to shape OERs in a way like this, especially Indigenous-led OERs, and how can we incorporate more community voices, uplift community voices into Indigenous OERs. In addition, thinking about Indigenous research, there is the recognition of the colonial past of Indigenous peoples, while also resisting colonial narratives. The resurgence of Indigenous ways of knowing and being rejects insider-outsider research, prevents from further research extraction, allows for Indigenous self-determination, and also combats the traditional power dynamics with the researcher versus the researchee. So in addition, so when I'm developing or thinking about developing OERs, consulting with communities, consulting with faculty members, with students, with communities, I'm thinking about these. How can we uplift voices? How can we prevent extraction? How can we do no harm within this? How can we push back and challenge in academia traditional research practices and who holds hierarchy and power in publishing and ownership as well over information within an academic setting? So a little bit just so that we're on the same page about Indigenous knowledges, stories, things like that. So one thing to note is Indigenous folks, we don't always focus our knowledge systems within binaries. The world is very subjective. And there's also, from Castellano, 5 characteristics of Indigenous ways of knowing and knowledges, and those that they're personal, orally transmitted with exception, experiential. So for example, I was talking and I showed a picture of kind of the area that I grew up in. I mean, in Manitoba, it's a little bit closer than it out here is on the coast, the landscape of Treaty 6. However, unless you're actually in the moment and you're there and experiencing what it's like to stand outside that grain elevator, the smells of Treaty 6, the sounds, it has to be experiential, and it can transform you, take you back to that space and evoke emotions in you when you are when you're engaging with those experiential thoughts. It's holistic and it's also narrative. Indigenous knowledges are also experienced and transmitted intergenerationally, so with kin, community, and through ceremony. So while thinking about this intergenerational transmission of knowledge, one of the things that I've been thinking about more recently is with Indigenous OERs. So how is that intergenerational transfer of knowledge going to be reflected within an OER? Is this something where we're going to have our youth working with our elders to create OERs? Is this something where youth are going to be seeing themselves reflected in a positive way in an OER that they might be engaging with in post-secondary education? Or even one thing that I don't engage very much with is the K-12 educational system. And what does an OER for, youth look like within K-12? How is that intergenerational transmission of knowledge going to look there? In addition, worldviews are highly important. My worldviews impact me in my everyday life as they're my worldviews. When we're thinking about Indigenous worldviews, we can think that knowledge is holistic, cyclical, and dependent on relationships and connections with living and non-living beings and entities. So this can be seen as relationality. There's many truths, and these truths are dependent upon individuals. Everything is alive. All things are equal. The land is sacred. The relationship between people and the spiritual world is important. And in some cases, human beings are the least important thing in the world. So relationality, especially within Western research, it projects this hierarchy where humans are placed on the top and then everything is below humans. Indigenous relationality connects humans and more than human relations and is embedded into our knowledge systems and laws. In addition, relationality has the ability to transcend the physical and the spiritual worlds and connects us to our ancestors, those who have not been born yet, and the creator beings. So how, when we're working with Indigenous OERs, how is relationality being expressed? Is this one of those things where almost the OER itself takes on a relationality to us? So can we see, I sometimes talk about within the context of working in a library, some of the monographs that we have, some of the archives that we steward, as well as some of the special collections and community stories that we steward in a physical form in books, those take on a life of their own. We can see those as being and having a deep connection with those items, being able to see the ancestors in them and the communities in them and having a relational sense to them. So how do we bring in relationality into the OER practice? One of the things that also with OER becomes a little bit more challenging is that Indigenous knowledge transfer looks very different than Western knowledge transfers. For most Indigenous communities, traditionally, knowledge is not just freely given, it's earned. The transmission of knowledge can be informed by our legal traditions and our protocols, and protocols vary from community to community and are generally informed by the following factors. So there's things like relationships based off of kin and clan systems, gender specific, age specific, geographically influenced. So an elder once told me our knowledges and our stories are tied to the land and the lands that they come from. Seasonal. So right now is storytelling time for many communities across Turtle Island. In general, winter is when we see some stories being awoken in ceremony. Stories for myself, like there actually is snow on the ground in Vancouver today. So Wasaki stories. So I can say that, but also in Treaty 6, there's snow on the ground. So Wasaki stories can be winter stories. So when thinking about the creation of an OER, something that is born digital and can be accessed at any point, how do we bring those seasonal protocols into OERs? In some cases, we talk about, especially with the podcast that I do, the cultural red tape, because even within the podcast that I'm part of, we have stories that are shared by community members that are winter stories. So for example, we did an episode of amiskwaciy, which is the Book Women podcast, that had our friend Josh Littlechild telling us Wasaki stories because we were there in the wintertime at his house recording. So when we were working with our elders on what do we do? So do we pull these stories from the platform? Do we pull this episode from the platform every summer? Or is there a way that we can keep this up? So the elders let us know that we could try talking about community protocol at the beginning of the episode and then embed the sound of crunching snow between someone's feet, the sound of falling snow into the podcast episode, that it's kind of sounding like you're there and having that discussion about protocol and knowledge transfer and community stories. In addition, knowledge transfer can be informed by the specific techniques or modes of production around that knowledge as well. So when thinking about Indigenous OERs and the creation of Indigenous OERs, one of the things that I've been kind of pushing folks towards, especially within a localized context, is bringing in freely available frameworks, pedagogies that Indigenous people, authors, academics are using to kind of reshape how we see ourselves in education, to inform ourselves on how we interact within academia. And these are some of the ones that I kind of pulled that folks, especially in the room, if you're thinking about creating an OER that has Indigenous content or you're working with communities, I mean, if you're working with communities, use those localized kind of worldviews and understandings to create OERs, but within kind of a more general academic sense. These are some of the ones that I've been looking at more recently and thinking about how we can apply them to the concept of open educational resources. So the first one that I kind of pulled was story work from Dr. Joanne Archibald. And this is, how do we bring stories into an educational context? So how would we bring stories, Indigenous stories, into an open educational context? And so Dr. Archibald brings out the 7 principles of story work, which are respect, responsibility, reciprocity, reverence, holism, interrelatedness, and synergy that form the framework for understanding the characteristics of story, and appreciates the process of storytelling. So how could we take this and have OERs created and formed in a way that they're telling a story? It's not just like my lovely slideshow here, where it's just going slide from slide, page by page, chapter to chapter. How does it weave together or flow together in a storytelling mode? As well as story work establishes a receptive learning context and engages in holistic meaning making. Participating in two-eyed seeing. So this is Dr. Albert Marshall, Elder Albert Marshall, who is Mi'kmaq. And two-eyed seeing is a philosophical, theoretical, and methodological approach that recognizes both the need for Western and Indigenous paradigms in approaches to research, knowledge translation, as well as program planning, development, and implementation. So using a two-eyed seeing approach, how can we create Indigenous OERs or Indigenous educational resources that bring in that two-eyed seeing approach, have that Western approach to them as it is being created in Western platform, using things like curriculum development, which is very much so a Western context, but also bringing in Indigenous understandings, methodologies to them. Elder brother teachings, so traditional stories, and this is outlined by Robert Innes, so traditional stories of things like Wisaki or elder brother that outline social interaction, marriage, adoption, and kinship roles and responsibilities. Also with this, how do we bring in kinship into educational resources, into Indigenous educational resources? How do we talk about things like Wakotuan, Miowasituan, Pimatuasuan, Kiukwean, so the visiting which is Cindy Gaudet's visiting methodology. How do we bring in these interactions and kin interactions into OERs? And we have interactions, settler, Indigenous folks from different regions across Turtle Island all together, and that needs to be recognized within OERs as well. And also some methods. So I think I pulled some of the that mostly are from this coast, but not. There's methods from across all areas in Turtle Island that we can look at as well. So I started off with Karina Sparrow's Reclaiming Space Between. So this is Coast Salish Two-Spirit Identities and Experiences. And Karina uses the 4 house posts of the Longhouse and their experience within being in the Longhouse at Musqueam as their method within their paper. We have Georgina Martin's Drumming My Way Home, which uses the method of the Shwetmek hand drum. Jackie Green's Heisla stories about traditional feasting and lifestyles that talk about the Ulakan harvest as a method. And it's the Ulakans are running right now too. So lots of folks have been talking about it and talking about making Ulakan grease and things like that lately. And well as Dion Kazis is embodying the past and present through tattooing and tattooing revivals. So looking at ancestral tattoo revivals as a method. So how can we use things like localized community perspectives, understandings, worldviews, and bring those methods into open educational resources, the development of them, the design of them, and how do we better them through these understandings. In addition, the 4 R's of Indigenous education. So I know the 4 R's a lot. They base some of the foundation of the Longhouse, which we'll talk about in a second, but also Dr. Verna Kirkness is a presence in my life as she is usually over in the Longhouse. We see her often, but it sounds like she might be moving back to her homeland, so I won't be able to see her as much. But thinking about the 4 R's of Indigenous education and much with the development of the 4 R's, some really hard questions were asked. And Kirkness and Barnhart were asking these hard questions about post-secondary education to develop the 4 R's. And the hard questions that they asked were, why do universities continue to perpetuate policies and practices that historically have produced abysmal results for First Nation students and have continued the legacy of colonialism? So when thinking about Indigenous open educational resources, how can universities, not perpetuate policies and practices that continue to do harm within open or within this understanding of open? Why are universities so impervious to the existence of de facto forms of institutionalized discrimination that they are unable to recognize the threat that some of their accustomed practices pose on their own existence? And then what are some of the obstacles that must be overcome if universities are to improve the levels of participation and completion of First Nation students? And even within thinking about open educational resources, if we are creating OERs that have the intent of being used by Indigenous students, especially Indigenous students in remote, rural locations, northern communities, there poses an even more of a challenge as, we already know that there are problems with bandwidth, problems with connectivity for communities. So OERs might not always fit. The concept of providing educational resources that are low barrier does, but OERs might not fit into this, especially when they're digital. So the 4 R's of Indigenous education that Kirkness and Barnhart came up with were respect. So respect for First Nations cultural integrity, relevance. So relevance to First Nations perspectives and experiences, reciprocity. So reciprocal relationships, and then responsibility. So responsibility on the part of the university and through the active participation of doing better. So this is not, we write a policy, we talk about it, we actually have to be participating and making active change. At the Longhouse, we use hands forward, hands back teachings. So holding our right palm down passes on teachings to the younger generation, holding it up, it holds up to the ancestors. So continuing the circle of care, growth, and understanding. For myself, this reminds me of how we hold our hands in round dances. So holding our hands up and then back as well to each other. And then the 4 R's of the UBC Longhouse. So the UBC Longhouse is part Amiskwaciy Library, where I am right now. We make up the First Nations House of Learning. And so FNHL, within our daily practices, we use these R's to kind of act in a good way with another. So these are respect. So respect forms the foundations and our values of FNHL. Relationships, so it speaks to all of our connection to all creation, the creator, and all of our relationship. Responsibility, and so enhancing our understanding of well-being and what diminishes it, and making and also taking responsibility and strengthening it. And then reverence, respect for the sacred as well. So respect for traditional knowledges, respect for ancestors, respect for the sacredness of the land that we are on. And even within being an administrator at Kwikwah, one of the things that I think about now is how can I use the 4 R's for framing tough conversations that we have here at the library. So for example, bringing in reverence to talk about Kwikwah Library, that we've been here since 1970. It was founded by an amazing Indigenous librarian, Dr. Jean Joseph, and it very much so is rooted in, and we remember what Kwikwah Library was built to do, but then we also bring in relevance into it. So from the other R's, bringing in relevance, remembering the reverence and our foundation. However, we need to stay relevant with things like the Indigenous Strategic Plan, with the push towards more open content by the Tri-Council agencies. So how do we support people as we move forward in academia while also thinking about the reverence as well? Indigenous sovereignty plays a huge part in OERs, especially thinking about protocols, ownership, and access to information within OERs. So as folks hopefully know in the room, that under Section 35 of the Constitution Act, the Government of Canada recognizes that Indigenous folks, so specifically I'm talking about FNMI, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, have the inherent right to self-government and self-determination. As well as, so what this means is that the inherent right of Indigenous peoples within Canada, we have it to govern ourselves in relations to matters that are internal to our own communities, internal to our unique cultures, integral to our unique cultures, identities, traditions, languages, and institutions, and with our respect to the land and resources on those lands as well. However, when we're thinking about Indigenous sovereignty, things like the Canadian Copyright Act really do compete with aspirations for Indigenous communities over sovereignty and self-governance over our own knowledges, and who gets to claim ownership of knowledges, especially when it comes to publishing, academia. So one of the issues is that when we're looking at things like traditional knowledges, which are the hardest ones to kind of protect under Canadian copyright law, this is because often our knowledges are seen as not being able to qualify for protection due that they're too old and therefore in the public domain. There's no author of the material in a traditional sense, and the author is not being able to be identifiable. Thus, there's no right holder. Traditional knowledges are owned collectively by Indigenous communities for cultural claims and not by individuals or corporations for economic claims. And in a lot of cases, we see that the Canadian Copyright Act has allowed for the legalized theft of Indigenous knowledges through the guise of Western understandings of ownership and intellectual property. So what can we do, especially since quite a few OERs are digital objects through things like Pressbook? We can look at kind of practices that are informed by the concept of data sovereignty when developing Indigenous educational resources. And so, or Indigenous data sovereignty as well. So the concept of data sovereignty is unique to the 21st century and is caused by the increased availability of data being available online. The term data sovereignty simply implies the means by which managing information is consistent with laws, practices, and customs of the nation state in which it is located. Indigenous data sovereignty centers Indigenous peoples' collective rights to data about peoples, territories, life waves, culture, cultural heritage, and natural resources, and it's supported by Indigenous peoples' inherent rights to self-determination and governance. Indigenous data sovereignty puts forward the following principles, and those principles are that Indigenous nations have the right to ownership and governance over data about them, regardless of where it is held or who holds it. Indigenous nations have the right to govern data in a way that aligns with their own data protocols and laws. Indigenous peoples have the right to access data that supports nation rebuilding. This includes access to government documents, historic, contemporary, and archival. And Indigenous data sovereignty supports cultural sovereignty. So Indigenous sovereignty is threatened when cultural sovereignty is violated through exploitation, theft, and misrepresentation of cultures, especially through things like qualitative data. So cultural sovereignty is essential for the survival of Indigenous culture, languages, songs, stories, and as well as the land, which is integral to our way of life. Some of the things that have kind of come out of activism that we can also look towards for supporting this ownership and protection of Indigenous knowledges within an open landscape are things like GIDA, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance's Fair Care Principles, and the IEEE Provenance that just recently came out. So GIDA Fair Care follows the open principles of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but then adds on care to it. And care is collective benefit, authority of control, responsibility, and ethics. And then we have OCAP. So McCracken and Hogan mentioned OCAP within their practice, their paper. And OCAP stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession of First Nations Knowledges. One of the things that OCAP does is it provides training. If folks don't have OCAP training, I highly recommend taking the course. And the course is housed through FNIGC and taught also, I believe you take it through Mohawk College. It was just updated from the original. So now there is a new update to the course. One of the things as well is that now, FNIGC also runs, so that's the First Nations Information Governance Connect, also runs the First Nations Data Center, which houses a lot of Indigenous health data and health information. One of the things that they're saying now is that you actually need to complete the fundamentals of OCAP before accessing any unpublished data from the First Nations Data Center as well. And then there's also principles for Métis specific research. And these are the 6 principles that we have. So reciprocal relationships, respect, safe and inclusive, using Métis context. Research should also be relevant, benefit all, contribute to Métis cultural heritage and the protection of that cultural heritage, and then recognize diversity. And then we also have Inuit research. So the principles for Inuit research look at rights holder, agency, respect, it's proactive, it includes Inuit voices and focuses on the homeland as well. So there are many different tools, frameworks that we can use depending on if you're working with First Nations, Métis, or Inuit research, data, and outputs, as well as more on a global context. So when I was coming into the 6 R's of OERs and thinking about open educational resources. And I was asked to give a presentation on my own interpretation of Indigenous open educational resources. I came up using the 4 R's of Indigenous education and the 4 R's of the Longhouse with the 6 R's of Indigenous OERs. However, I've been starting to frame my language a little bit differently with thinking about Indigenous open and what is open, especially after being home in Treaty 6 for a conference and speaking with elders and them saying that we don't really have a word that talks about open within this context. So maybe instead of saying open, they're Indigenous educational resources. So even within the language that we're using and trying to frame these, how do we do that? So the 6 R's that I came up of Indigenous educational resources are respect for Indigenous cultural identity, communities, and topics within the educational resource. Relationships, so connecting the concept of all of our relations and relationship building within the resource. Responsibility, so only sharing when we're allowed, doing it in an ethical way, and considering ownership protocols and community practices. Respecting the land under reverence. Relevance is legitimizing and incorporating Indigenous knowledges into the curriculum when it makes sense. And then reciprocity, giving back. So there's lots of things about moving forward. We're having conversations on a national level. We're having conversations on a local level, but really trying to think differently when moving forward. So ensuring that Indigenous consent and protocols and voices are incorporated into OERs and also incorporated into these discussions about framework building, about funding, about advocacy on a larger level by institutions such as Carl, Canadian Association of Research Libraries, other folks who do curriculum development, other folks who advocate for higher education, for K-12 education. So making sure that Indigenous voices are heard within those communities as well. Incorporating pedagogies into the development of OERs, and also do R's make sense? This is something that an elder brought up to me a couple weeks ago, that in the Stolo language, they don't actually use R's in the language. In Nihiawean, there's also a lack of R's. So using R's, does this actually make sense? What role does education and open education play into Indigenous education? So thinking about on-reserve learning, off-reserve learning, elders, urban youth, urban Indigenous folks, folks who are living in areas like the downtown east side. How can OERs or educational resources support these folks? And then also, is there a 7th R? How do we throw reflection into there? And I think a lot of what we do is reflecting, thinking about the past, looking towards to the future. How do we adapt OER technologies to adhere to protocol needs? So things like Pressbooks, how do we make Pressbooks able to adhere to protocol needs? And how do we advocate for Indigenous controlled OERs and funding on a provincial, local, and national scale, where Indigenous voices are being centered for this advocacy and funding? And given that, I'm from Treaty 6 territory, the R's were not necessarily making sense. It was a lot of R's kind of just looking very blankly on a page. When I was back home, I thought about how can I create my own framework around Indigenous resources, Indigenous open educational resources that make sense based off of the land that I'm connected to and my own worldview. So I've been starting to kind of play and adapt and look at what I was calling the wild rose framework. As wild roses grow quite significantly around the Beaver Hills, around Amiskwaciy, I can look at this picture, I can smell them, I can think about where the big rose bushes are by my house outside of Tofield. I can also think about how roses, they're resilient, they grow wild in so many places, yet they're so beautiful and powerful. So I took the R's and adapted them into the wild rose framework. Also, as a Métis woman, flower beadwork is very prevalent within our communities. So what I did is I positioned reverence in the middle of the flower. It's what's holding us together, that respect for the sacred, our ancestors, the land in the center, with relationships, respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and relevance forming the rest of the flower. When I was thinking about the 7th R, reflection going outwards and being the vines or the bush of the wild rose as well. And I picked a wild rose because they grow quite far across Turtle Island as well. So that's one of the things as well when developing these frameworks, is that it doesn't work for every community. Not every place on Turtle Island, or what some communities call Turtle Island, will have roses. So for Inuit communities, this would be represented differently. Out here on the coast, this would be represented differently. In Manitoba, even, you might represent this differently as what is the localized community's understanding and content. So this is something that I'm constantly adapting and bringing into my work and trying to think about. So that is it for me. I have time for questions. I think one of the things that I just wanted to also reiterate as we are closing up is that we don't have any solid understandings or agreements on Indigenous open educational resources or Indigenous educational resources. This is a new area for us, and it's something that we're starting to think very widely about, as there are people that are creating Indigenous-based OERs that don't have this content, or are not working with Indigenous communities when creating it. There's a need for this, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take voices from many different places on actually being able to develop a national framework, which might be many years away. There's conversations, but I don't think we're quite there yet. Localized frameworks, yes, we can definitely do that. But on a national scale, this is something that's going to be very tricky given how diverse everybody is. So that's it for me. I will stop sharing for questions. Perfect. And I'm back.
Hi, Kayla. Kichi Marcy for your informative presentation. You can probably see us. There's about 20 people in the room, and the room is buzzing from the need to ask questions. So any questions for Kayla?
Thank you so much, Kayla, for your presentation. My name is Michelle, and I work at the Center for Advancement of Teaching and Learning here in the capacity of Indigenous Initiatives Educator, and I really loved your presentation. And I also really love what you said about knowledge being local, and as knowledge as resting inland, and it's so specific to where we are. I'm wondering what advice you would give to someone who potentially is thinking of developing an OER, but I'm here in Treaty 1, which is the homeland of Red River Métis and Anishinaabe and Cree and Dakota, and there's a huge Inuit population as well. So how do we manage big question, kick things off? But
yeah, that it is a big question. And especially one of the things that I've been thinking about, given the context of especially like where UBC is. So UBC also has a CTLT that's run and has Indigenous initiatives, which are run by Amy Perot. And while working on kind of like rethinking a more of that localized perspective of resources that are coming out of academic institutions like UBC, U of M, US, is consulting with our already previously established elder supports and services as we can. So if you have like an elder that works with the university, how would they how would they guide in the creation of an OER? And it's hard to get those community voices in, but thinking about, what would their guidance be on this? How would they support us in having those voices come in, or if it's appropriate to add all those voices in? And I think this is where it gets really tricky. At UBC, it's very different because we're on Musqueam territory. So we have Elder Larry that we can talk to. But when we are thinking about OERs that involve the Lower Mainland, we still go to Elder Larry to kind of guide us. If needed, if it's very specific, like only Stolo, or only Squamish, only Tsleil-Waututh, then we reach out to those communities, but also still having that guidance from Elder Larry, as he is the elder for the university, and this is where the item is coming out of. But it is tricky when you have voices. I know when I was living in Edmonton, as I spent most of my life there, I've only been in Vancouver for 3 years, that was a challenge too, with Treaty 6 there, having Métis, Cree, who else is up there? Métis, Cree, some Dene folks coming down from Treaty 8, Blackfoot from Treaty 7. So trying to think about how do we incorporate those voices and have voices included. And I think that's a nice thing about OERs, that when we are having those voices included, there is the opportunity, if given, to also add voices later. OERs are not necessarily fixed. if someone says, hey, you should, you know, maybe incorporate this, we can. It's not something like a book where we have to necessarily be doing massive second editions or things like that, massive revisions. That adaptability can be our friend, but it can also be one of those things where we just don't want to be revising community stories in a way that don't make sense. I know that's not really a great answer to your question, as it is really complicated. And I think the complication is sometimes nice, but it is a bit daunting too. Like, what do we do and what is the best protocol? But I would say if you have elders on campus, work with them, see what their perspective is, see where they would go with it, and then take that lead and continue on in a way that makes sense for the OER and for your institution as well.
Micheline says miigwech. All right, the next question.
Thanks. Hello. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk and lots of really amazing ideas. One question I had just generally was, I mean, I found it really fascinating what you were saying about the relational aspects of Indigenous knowledge and the need to, in a way, demonstrate that one is ready to receive particular knowledge before one is able to receive that. And I guess I'm just wondering, in terms of the technology of the internet and how it seems a lot of what OER are now is a kind of a reflection of a certain vision of the internet as having maybe one, like you were suggesting, rooted in a very early phase of the internet, or the idea of everything being universally accessible. And I'm wondering, do you find that there's an inherent conflict there between the technology and the knowledge, or are there ways through the technology to provide these kinds of controls, or this kind of ownership over knowledge that you're proposing, I guess?
Yeah, there's 100% conflict in knowledge. Like, I know when I go back home and work with elders, it's very much so the thing when, you have to give tobacco, there's protocol that comes with gaining specific knowledges. However, if somebody hears an elder telling me a story, they can take that, write it on the internet, and then it's there. Or someone can publish that in a book, then that book is digitized. And then it's really hard to get things back once it's been made publicly available and digitized, made available through things like OCLC, whatever. So I think when trying to think about how we can kind of mitigate these risks of things being made public, and even looking at things that are already out there that are public and maybe shouldn't be, this is a challenge. And I've seen organizations do everything from putting up notices on digital content that says like that this does not necessarily represent the view of the community. This is a historic view that was taken in an ethnocentric understanding of like early anthropologists or early researchers, to having takedown protocols where if a community notices that there's a story or a video that's been published on a website where there's a takedown notice, where communities can write in and say, hey, can you take this down? But I think when it actually comes to the development of technologies, we're really not there yet. It's one of those things where developers have not, other than some like Mercadoo, which is a CMS that allows for community archiving, I don't think we're really there. And I think it's conversations that's happening, especially amongst Indigenous communities, Indigenous activists, Indigenous educators. But yeah, I think there is conflict, and there will continue to be conflict, as I don't see any solid solution right now, other than just to keep having conversations about it. And then maybe one day someone will come up with something.
Yeah, no, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Is that Shirley in the room? Hi, I thought I saw you. I was like, I know that person.
Lyle's behind me.
Hello. Hi, Lyle. Sorry, I do know some people in the room. I know. Sorry, totally just just went off on a side during the commenting. Shirley's like an amazing up and coming Indigenous librarian. So good to see you.
Okay, we have a question online from Cynthia Costa.
Okay.
And Cynthia says, thanks a million for this enriching presentation. We have recently launched our graduate teaching program that is online and asynchronous. We're hoping that it becomes an OER, and we would love to receive your suggestions on how to proceed and license it.
Yeah, so I think if it's a OER that's being created, and I'm just going to read this again. So one thing that we can do is within OERs, we can use things like Creative Commons licensing within them. Depending on what you have and depending on what you want to do with the course, you can add those CC licenses. And I would highly suggest reaching out to whoever's working in the copyright office at the libraries, because they can also help you with things like that, or we're reaching out to one of the librarians. If there's Indigenous content within it, that's a little bit different. And so when working with Indigenous content and licensing, there are communities such as Local Contexts, which have developed licenses. So cultural institution licenses, or not, yeah, CI licenses, which are not like the traditional knowledge labels, because the traditional knowledge labels are only to be used by communities and not by institutions, but they do have CI licenses and notices which acknowledge that traditional knowledges or community stories are being used in digital items, but that either communities have not been consulted or it's an institution that's using these licenses, not a specific community. And so those are things that we can look at as well. For that, you have to be, if you want to use those licenses alongside Creative Commons licensing, you have to become part of their knowledge hub now, from what I understand. But that is one thing, if there's community knowledge is being used, that you can use as well in terms of licensing on digital objects such as OERs.
All right, great. Any other questions from the room? Julie.
Sorry, what did CI stand for again?
Cultural institution. So on Local Contexts, they have a couple different ones. I can put it in the chat. So Local Contexts, they have their traditional knowledge licenses as well as the institution ones. And so the institution ones are meant to be used by like universities, things like that, that aren't necessarily working with communities as well. Or they have also things like disclosure licenses, care notices, engagement notices, things like that. So I would, if you're thinking about using anything from a Local Context, get a hold of the folks who work within that organization and see how they might want to support the projects that you're working with, because they can be quite picky on who they let use their licenses and who not. So.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, let's see what the other comment was online. So the other question online was about being new to OER and where would I start?
Oh, so I would say if you're new to OER, I don't know if because I did not look into it. If U of M has an OER librarian, go talk to the librarian, because librarians are great. So I would say reaching out to an OE librarian, or even if you have the opportunity to meet with folks from like a CTLT unit about curriculum design and open educational resources and how they might be able to support that as well, that is helpful, as well as engaging with the OE community, attending webinars, attending other talks like during OE weeks that are happening across Turtle Island, I think is a good place to start. Getting yourself familiar with some of the technologies that exist out there as well, to help you be able to develop and support, as well as looking at some OEs that are already in use. And I think there's a panel coming up right after this where it's going to be people talking about developing and using, and sometimes learning from folks who are currently working with them is the best thing. But I would suggest if there is a librarian that can help you, definitely talk to them or curriculum designers.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, one more call for questions from the floor. All right, thank you so much, Kayla. Let's give it up for Kayla. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're going to